17 years old, Cristiano scored 5 goals. At 18 years old, he scored 6 goals. At 19 years old, he scored 9 goals. At 20 years old, he scored 12 goals. At 21 years old, he scored 23 goals. At 22 years old, he scored 42 goals. At 23 years old, he scored 26 goals. At 24 years old, he scored 33 goals. At 25 years old, he scored 53 goals. At 26 years old, he scored 60 goals. At 27 years old, he scored 55 goals. At 28 years old, he scored 51 goals. At 29 years old, he scored 61 goals. At 30 years old, he scored 51 goals. At 31 years old, he scored 42 goals. At 32 years old, he scored 44 goals. At 33 years old, he scored 28 goals. At 34 years old, he scored 37 goals. At 35 years old, he scored 36 goals. At 36 years old, he scored 24 goals. At 37 years old, he scored 17 goals. At 38 years old, he scored 54 goals. At 39 years old, he scored 43 goals. Would you be able to guess how many goals he will score at 40 years old?